მინდა წარმოგიდგინოთ ქალბატონის სვეტლანა, რომელიც ჩამოვიდა ვაშინგტონიდან და გახლავთ აი ამ ცნობილი Doing Business ანგარიშის ერთ-ერთი თანაავტორი, უკვე საკმაოდ დიდი ხანია ჩართული არის აი ამ ანგარიშის მომზადებაში. მას აქვს თან პრეზენტაცია, რომელიც საკმაოდ კარგად აღწერს მეთოდოლოგიას და იმას თუ როგორ ხდება ზოგადად აი ამ შედეგების შეფასება, რა მეთოდოლოგიის დამყარება და შემდეგ. რატო არის ეს მნიშვნელოვანი? იმიტომ რომ ძალიან ხშირად ხდება კითხვა, რომ აი საქართველოს თქვა ესე წინ მიწევს, რატო, რა სადარებს თქვა აზერბაიჯანზე გაჩნდა დღეს კითხვა, სომხეთზე და ასე შემდეგ. ანუ დეტალურად საკმაოდ აღიხსნით, მაგრამ მე მგონი კითხვები წესით უნდა გაგისცეთ უშუალოდ კონკრეტულად საქართველოს შესახებ. ანუ ეს არის ზოგადი პრეზენტაცია და მათ შორის ფარავს გარკვეულ ასპექტებს უშუალოდ საქართველოსთან მიმართებაში, თუმცა წესით რაღაცა კითხვებიც უნდა გაჩნდეს. და ეხლა ვთხოვს სვეტლანას, რომ დაიწყოს ინგლისურად იქნება პრეზენტაცია, მე მგონი არანაირი პრობლემა არ უნდა.
Thank you very much there. I didn't understand anything you said, but I'm sure. It's a great pleasure to be here in Tbilisi. I used to work in Georgia quite a bit in my previous life as a consultant for a company called Buzali Hamilton. So I spent quite a bit of time here in Tbilisi and outside of the city as well. So very happy to be here. My presentation will be in 3 parts. First, we will briefly discuss the methodology of the project, what the project measures, what it doesn't measure. Then I will walk you through the results of the report for this year globally, and then we will look at Georgia's specific performance. The Doing Business indicators are divided into 2 parts. First, it's so-called time and motion studies. Here we follow entrepreneur through a specific procedure. Here is an example of starting a business in Georgia. We look at the domestic enterprise, at the limited liability company with 5 domestic owners. So in order to register such a company here in Tbilisi, it takes only 3 procedures, 3 days, and 3.7% of income per capita. This is one of the indicators where Georgia ranks in top 10 globally. The second type of indicators are so-called legal indices. These indicators are based more on the book of law rather than on practice. So here is an example of indicator called protecting investors. Here we measure 3 specific aspects of related party transactions. It's the requirements of approval and disclosure of such transactions. It's the liability of the CEO of the company and board of director in case that the company suffers losses as a result of this related party transaction. And also it's the ease of shareholders too. So here we look at the evidence that has to be collected before and during the trial for the minority shareholders to recover their assets. This is one of the indicators where Georgia does fairly well, but still there is some room for improvement. For example, in the area of requirements of approval and disclosure of the related party transactions. So what the project measures in general? So we focus on the regulations relevant to a full life cycle of a company. So we follow the domestic entrepreneur through business startup procedures and then those typical transactions that the company would have to go through over its lifetime, such as transferring property or getting construction permits, hiring workers, paying taxes, and so on and so forth until the company is being closed. So here we look at the bankruptcy procedures. The way we collect the data is quite simple. We have around 8,000 contributors around the globe, including over 50 contributors here in Tbilisi. It's typically legal practitioners, representative of construction companies, logistical companies. We also interview government representatives as well. Every year, the Doing Business team that is based in Washington, D.C. Visits around 70 countries globally in order to verify the data. We visit company registers, property registers, tax officials, and try to understand and get a feel on the ground of the reforms and of the reality that domestic entrepreneurs face in a given country. We have standardized case scenarios in order to measure the indicators. So it's the same case study for all 183 countries. Typically, we describe a situation, for example, 5 domestic owners trying to start a manufacturing company and hire 50 workers. So what are their time, cost, and number of procedures they will have to through in order to do so? In our global study, we look only at the capital, so Tbilisi, in the case of Georgia, which is also the most populous city. Understanding that in some countries, particular countries with a federal system, the business reality can be different in different cities, we conduct subnational studies. So up to date, we've looked into over 200 cities around the world. Such study was conducted in India, in Egypt, in Colombia, and Russian Federation. Now we're finishing it in the Central Asian republics. The study focuses on formal sector, meaning that we do not measure bribes, we do not measure corruption per se. But one of the main premises of the Doing Business report is that simple and transparent regulations actually the best remedy against corruption. If the information about business procedures is readily available to entrepreneurs, and the physical contact between entrepreneur and the government is minimized, here the opportunities for corruption diminish. The number of aspects that the project does not measure, even though it's an important piece of a much bigger puzzle called regulatory climate or business climate, we do not look into macroeconomic stability, into political stability, quality of workforce, physical security. So all other important factors that investors take into account when they choose one or another country to invest into. So I already mentioned the basic methodology issues of the project. We have 183 countries today, and they all ranked on the ease of doing business. When we say ease of doing business here, we mean as measured by 10 indicators of the project. Since the beginning of the project, we added about 50 economies, so the sample grew from 133 to 183. There are a number of reasons why ranks change and this 183 country move up and down. First reason why the rankings change is reforms, and this year was the record year in terms of regulatory reforms around the world. Also, the rankings can change because one of the economies reformed, another simply did not. So the rank can drop not because the country had done something wrong or introduced a negative reform, but simply because other countries done more. Another driving factor is changes of the methodology. This year we introduced only one such change in the employing workers indicator. And also we revised the data in order to present our report in the best possible way. The data correction for this year was around 5%. So looking at the project over time, you see that every year we introduce new features to the project. So this year, beyond the 10 doing business indicators, we also looked into 2 pilot indicators. One of them is a research focusing on the core labor standards as measured by international organization, and another one is the new infrastructure indicator. Here we look at time, cost, and number of procedures to obtain electricity connection in the country. Right now, these 2 indicators are not part of the ranking. They published as an appendix to the main report. And at the moment, we're going through rigorous peer review. We consult academia, private sector, and executive directors of the World Bank in order to see whether these 2 indicators should be part of the overall rankings. When we look at the top performers as measured by the project, you will see that Georgia improved its ranking and now ranked 11th in the world. It's also top performing countries in the former Soviet Union space, quite closely followed by 3 Baltic countries. The reason why Baltic countries improved their performance so dramatically is the European Union accession. They had to revise their regulations in order to comply with European ones. In case of Georgia, we observed quite a comprehensive program that was started about 4 years ago, when Georgia was actually ranked hundreds out of 170 economies. When we look at our study this year, we noticed a number of interesting trends. Regardless of the fact that the world is in the middle of the global economic crisis, the pace of reform was the fastest ever since the beginning of the project. On average, we recorded 20% more reforms than in any given year when the report came out. This is hardly surprising. In order to faster recover, countries strive to create new jobs and create an environment conducive for a business startup. Another interesting feature is that the region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia has been fastest reforming region for the past 6 years. And this year's 5 of top 10 reformers came also from this region. I will note that Georgia wasn't at least 3 years in a row, but today it reached such a high position that it's difficult to become a top reformer, because we look at the relative movement in the rankings. So today, even if Georgia will improve by 10 places and overtake Singapore, which is currently #1, then probably it will not be enough to become the top reformer. As you can see, the rankings spread quite widely in the region. Georgia is ranked 11th, so it's the top performing economy in the region, and Tajikistan takes 152nd place. So we see quite a huge difference. Even if we look at high-income OECD countries, you will see as well such a dramatic difference. Countries like Greece, for example, or Portugal do not rank that well on the ease of doing business. As I mentioned, the pace of reforms was the quickest this year since the project started in 2003. 26 economies out of 27 from the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region introduced at least one reforms to improve its business environment. Again, briefly looking at the top reformers this year, you see 4 countries from the former Soviet Union space. An interesting feature here is that at least 3 out of these 4 countries at some point came to Georgia to learn about Georgia's reform experience. Specifically, Kyrgyz Republic looked at Georgian system of construction permits, Belarus looked at the business startup, Tajikistan looked at reform programs across the board. So one doesn't need to go too far in order to find best practices. So it's no longer, countries with high income. These best practices can be found here in Georgia. Again, just quickly, you will see the huge diversion in terms of ranks in the region. Azerbaijan was a top reforming country last year, and again, the government looked at Georgia's example quite closely in the area of construction permit, electronic taxation, and also business startup. Starting a business traditionally is the most popular reform in the Doing Business project. Again, this is most intuitive reform, so to speak. In order to expedite job creations, countries look to ease a burden on business startup. Georgia started this reform quite a number of years ago, and today ranks in top 10 countries on the ease of starting a company. So, and today there are 15 companies registered per 100 citizens of Georgia. This is as many as, for example, in Malaysia or Singapore. Doing business is quite a new project. So here we still do not have a hard research economical data to show the link between ease of regulation and macroeconomic data. But in some countries we already have enough data and statistics to be able to say that, for example, easier business startup leads to higher GDP growth and job creations. We conducted such study in Mexico, for example, and the research shows that in the Mexican states, which have better and simpler requirement for business startup, on average, the unemployment is low by 2.8%. And even price is low by 0.2%, simply because more companies are being started and the competition is higher. Here, as I mentioned, Georgia is one of the countries where other reformers to be come for best regional practices. When we look at the countries that perform best in each of the doing business indicators, there are a number of similar features. For example, it's complete automation of the processes. It's online filing. In New Zealand, it's possible to start a business without even leaving your office or home. In Hong Kong, for example, part of obtaining of construction permits is completely automized. Paying taxes, again, should be fully automated. This is one of the areas that Georgian government is working quite closely with the private sector. The online filing system already exists, so now just the question of educating the taxpayers and making sure that this filing actually is being made online. Another popular reform is closing a business. Again, I think quite intuitive reform in the conditions of the global crisis. Again, that limited research that we have on the matter shows that in those countries where it's easy to close a business, more companies start out. Simply because you have a right to fail, to close your business and start fresh. Also, closing a business is an important reform from the creditor's point of view. The faster is the process, the more chances the creditor has to recover its collateral. Another popular reform this year is in the area of getting credit. Here we talk about credit information and also protecting rights of creditors and lenders. I think this is pretty clear that access to credit information and having credit history for private individuals and also companies is very important, not only in the time of the crisis, in order to assess the credit worthiness of the individual and be familiar with his or her repayment methods. Another important reform that we noticed this year in the area of protecting investors. Here we can see that the country is striving to improve its disclosure practices so that the minority shareholders could not be harmed during the related party transaction, and also increase extent of the director's liability in case that shareholders are losing out after such transaction. I already mentioned online filing, and as you can see, that the number of countries that use online filing dramatically increased over the past 2 years. Georgia is well on the way, and we had a meeting with the Minister of Finance this morning and the private sector representatives, and learned that the government is looking to have 100% of companies to file taxes electronically in the next couple of years. So how Georgia fares on all 10 indicators? As you can see, on 4 indicators, Georgia in top 10 globally, but still there are a couple of areas where Georgia can further improve its performance. We already discussed paying taxes indicator, and there are a couple of other areas where further reforms could be done. Trade is one of the areas where Georgia, again, been reforming consistently over the past 4 or 5 years. And as you can see, over time, there was a dramatic reduction of documents required for import and export, and also time to import and export. Another reform that I paid quite a close attention here is the reform of construction permits. Here, Georgia completely scrapped regulations that existed after the breakup of the Soviet Union and created a completely new system that now is being studied by the neighbors as one of the best practices. There were a couple of features to this reform. First of all, expedited simplified procedures for simple construction. I mean, this is pretty clear that the rigorous requirements are necessary when we talk about 20-story building, and when someone is trying to build a one-story little warehouse, that probably the requirements could be less rigorous. When I mentioned the areas where Georgia could further improve its performance, here we talk about protecting investors, extending the liability of the director and the related party transaction, and also enabling minority shareholders to pursue such a transaction in a more expeditious fashion. Also, in closing a business, even though Georgia introduced a new bankruptcy law 2 years ago, there's still simply not enough cases filed. We know that right now there are about 30 cases going through the bankruptcy courts to see whether this reform was efficient or not. So we just looking at further monitoring of the situation, and one of the recommendations that we made is that the government continues working with the bankruptcy professionals, with the trustees, and with court personnel dealing with bankruptcy cases in order to improve their qualifications and expedite the process quickly. Since the inception of the project, we recorded around 270 reforms that were inspired or informed by the doing business. And I'm very pleased to say that the Georgian reforms were quite inspirational for a number of economists in the region, and its experience in many areas are currently being studied by the neighbors. And at the end, I would like to invite you to visit our website, and you can find all sorts of information, country profiles, historical rankings, media materials. And now, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Can you talk more about how you measure the protection of investors? Because I'm wondering, like, one of the best ways to protect investors is not to let them invest at all. On the other side, investors should be protected by their common sense. And there is no 100% guarantee if you take that strategy. Simply, sometimes they take chances, they fail, and some companies win. So what's your attitude to this?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, our methodology is quite narrow. So we do not look at kind of the broad investor protection field. What we look at is the related party transaction. A simple one that a director of a company wants to sell trucks to another company where he has interest. And at the end of the transaction, it turns out that the transaction was harming minority shareholders. So simply saying he lost some money because he wanted to transfer money from one company to another. And then we follow the legal reality of the company. So we typically look at the company law, the commercial code, the procedural code, and then we see, so first of all, how the transaction was disclosed. Did it have to be approved by the general shareholders meeting? For example, in Georgia, such transactions do not have to be approved by the general shareholders meeting. It's typically the board, and the interested director has the right to vote. So the best practice in this regard is that the director, if he has interest, he should be completely removed from such transaction. And also, in terms of liability, even though the transaction was duly approved, he is still liable if the company loses out, or the minority shareholders lose out. Also, we look at what kind of access minority shareholders have to information of such company. In Georgia, for example, minority shareholder has to have an approval of the shareholders meeting in order to have access to, for example, commercial invoices, to contracts, and so on and so forth. So here, even though the methodology is quite limited, it still serves as a good indication, simply because the minority shareholders is typically the most abused, so to speak, investors, exactly. And if we look at the countries that rank in, let's say, top 30 on this indicator, you will typically see that the minority shareholders awarded, quite strong protections. Having said all that, I completely agree with you that there is such a thing as an investor's risk and investor's common sense. And a legislation, if as comprehensive as it possibly could be, cannot completely protect any investor from failure. So this is the market risk, and any qualified, smart investor would just have to realize that.
I have a question about the new pilot indicator, namely workers' protection. In fact, doing business benchmarks are excellent tool to advocate reforms and pick up reform priorities, and we here in Georgia used it many times to facilitate adoption of new liberal legislation, let's say. But here, with the introduction of this new indicator, and especially with the changes in the methodology of employing workers related to the social protection of workers, we see some controversy. And now, in my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but we cannot use this indicator to argue for further liberal reforms, and they, in contrast, may be used by the opposers of the reforms to argue their views. And do you think that there is a controversy with the whole ideology of the World Bank? And who inspired this? I do know that ILO has quite a big input and even big pressure to introduce that reform. How do you rule this controversy?
Well, first of all, again, we are in a condition of global crisis, and this is not business as usual. So what we're trying to do this year, and this was actually not even part of the methodology change, we tried to look at those unemployment protections that the government might have to offer. For example, the unemployment insurance, the retraining programs. So something that people take quite close to their heart when thousands of people around the country are losing jobs. So we're interested to see how the government protects its private sector, but also enables environment for these people to re-enter the private sector. In terms of pressures and all of that, you probably noticed that this new research is not part of the ranking. So right now we exploring various ideas, but it is likely that it will always be a standalone research. So this is something we're interested in because there are two sides of the story. So there is a side of the employer and the employee. So right now we're researching and exploring, but we really do not feel pressure, and also each country basically chooses its own regime. So this morning during the meeting with the Minister of Finance, this question actually came up, and he basically said that the government is not in a position to take this decision lightly. There will be extensive consultations with the private sector, with large companies that actually employ workers here in Georgia before any even potential changes can be considered. So we take the same approach. We do our research, and then we consult stakeholders, first of all, the private sector representative to decide, where we will take the indicator further. So, but this is work in progress.
So it will not be part of the
Probably
oral
not.
ranking?
Probably not.
I have the questions about the rankings. World Bank says that Georgia has 4 required documents for export and 4 required documents for import.
Yeah.
And in the reality, it's 2 documents for export and 3 for import. And we send you legislation translated that proves it, and it's also in practice. So do you have information why World Bank did count this? And the second also, World Bank didn't count one-step property registration reform. So now in Georgia you can register property going to banks, and it's one step and it's several hours.
How new is this reform?
It was implemented in April 2008. Actually, in April, so before the reform, you cannot do this property registration without notarization. But now at banks they have agency representatives, and they just prove this contract by the seal of NAP. So, and we send also this information to you, but it's not.
I'm sorry, just one comment. Would you could introduce yourself and then...
Yeah, I
so
was
that I know that
working.
you don't work
We were working in the same place, USID Business Climate Report.
I
So we
thought
are
so,
you
I thought
responded
so.
and we complete all your surveys.
Yeah. So I mean, then you perfectly know the way we collect the data. So everything comes from here, and then we try to reconcile. So the 2 indicators that you mentioned, these are time and motion indicators where we really measure practice. So
Trading cross border, sorry? You mean trading cross
yeah,
border?
closing, trading across borders and property registration.
Yep.
So here, what we basically do, we ask the property registry how many, what the majority of the transactions still go
It's
through.
20%. I have 20% are registered funds. It's not enough, it's a question.
Well, exactly. So if the majority still goes through the public registry, that we count that procedure.
So your role is majority more than 50%?
Yeah. So if we have the indication that 50% or close to 50% go through commercial banks, then we can look into that expedited procedure. So this is the rule of thumb. So whenever we have the indication from the private sector that they go through the banks, then we will start counting that procedure.
Okay, but you also have this rule. If there is 2 ways, you count the fast way.
Yeah,
In this case, this is a fast way going
So
to the
if,
bank.
but here you
So
talk
it's
about
a-
2 different
another way.
agencies.
Yeah, but still, it's a fast way to go to the bank compared to going to the NAP.
We can revisit the details. And the same thing is on the trading across borders. So we do not come up with which documents are required. So we ask the practitioners here, which documents have you submitted in the last year, and so that was the outcome. So if again there are the opinions, we can discuss it offline, and I'm sure we'll resolve that.
And then maybe you could touch base on the correction rate.
Yes, as I mentioned, we have around 5% correction rate every year. So if we, work with you or the government or the private sector, and we establish that some data point is not correct, we just make the change on the website.
Maybe to finalize this correction, it relates to the closing business data. In 2008, Doing Business report said that Georgia has implemented reform,
Yeah.
and it will be counted, I don't know, the next year, and Georgia will fall into the top 10 in this indicator. Later there was no word about that, and 2009 methodology says that if country has not more than 5 cases, bankruptcy cases, the practice is not counted, and there is an indication that there is no practice, something like that. And you just mentioned that there are more than 30 cases.
Yes, since the law was
here.
implemented.
So do you have some, I don't know, benchmark or
In
a
2008
figure when the reform will count?
It was counted. You actually was second top reformer in the indicator in 2008.
Yeah, but still figures are the same as it was in 2007.
So what we did this year, we looked at the statistics that we received from the bankruptcy courts, which did not indicate time reduction. So we know that 63 cases were submitted, from them 32 was accepted, but we just don't have enough information that the time reduced. So we're in very close contact with all the agencies here, but I mean, if you have additional information on that, that's very helpful. Yeah.
I do that.
Perfect.
One more question about e-filing.
Yeah.
So how many e-filers should we have in order e-filing reform is counted? Like in methodology, you say that it should be majority of medium companies.
Yes.
But it's very vague. What do you mean by medium companies? It's about turnover or?
How do you measure
It's defined by the case study.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
basically the
So
company.
the point is that Georgian medium-sized company, according, I don't know, we have here companies with the same turnover as in the methodology, and it's our large companies, and not small or medium-sized.
And it's about 30% are e-filings from this company. Are this enough?
We count Georgia's e-filing.
No, you didn't count. No. If you count e-filing, then its payment number should be 1, and we still have it.
No, but okay, I think we need a separate meeting with USA on all the methodology details.
So my question is about the getting credit. How do you eliminate this relationship? Only between banks and persons, or maybe how do you eliminate it? Because it's one of the bad points for Georgia in this area.
Here actually Georgia ranks well. I think it's number 30 in the world. And here we look at the credit information at active credit bureau, public or private in the country. And I mean, here again, Georgia made quite a significant progress. I think now it's around 13% of population that's covered by credit information. And the second side of this indicator is the legal rights of creditors and borrowers. Here we look at the priority of claims in a lending situation. Let's say I'm a bank, I lended money to a company, so if something goes wrong with the company, what would be a likely scenario? So here again, the collateralized claim come after tax, so there is a high chance that the lender will recover its assets. But I mean, again, we do not look at the actual lending situation because the project is it's really a legal research. We basically look at laws and regulation rather than the actual lending situation.
Thank you. These guys are my friends, but I'm not for business project. So my question is general. Now, I know that you started doing business case project a few years ago, but do you notice some correlation between best performers here in regard of reforms of liberalization and their future growth or real changes in GDP or something like that? Did you have some data already that proves that these two?
If you look at the top 30 countries, you will...
They are already reformed, I know, but... Yeah.
Exactly. So they're typically high-income economies with very small but stable GDP growth. So their growth is not dictated by reform, so to speak. There are other factors why this economy is where they are at the moment. I mean, the project is still young. So in economics, you basically start your research with 10 years of data. We don't have 10 years of data yet.
And how many years?
It's the 8th year. So, right now we try to look into these things in a number of economies, and I mean, we would be interested to take Georgia as an example. I already mentioned that we worked with Mexico quite closely, and there is growing body of research looking into business startup procedures and correlation of ease of starting a business with GDP growth and job creations. Here we can say that probably there is some causality between the ease of starting a business and macroeconomic indicators, but again, this is very early days, and I mean, we wouldn't claim that rigorous reform of 10 doing business indicators will necessarily lead to GDP growth.
You mentioned subnational reports.
Yeah.
Do you plan to have something like for, not exactly Georgia, but maybe South Caucasian?
Personally, I would love to.
South Caucasian countries, because it's also interesting, just at the very beginning of doing business project, Armenia was far ahead of Georgia and Azerbaijan, and we have now an opposite situation. And what are the reasons why it happened? Does Armenia just stop doing anything, or there was a reverse movement, or whatever? So you plan to do that, or it just?
If we receive such requests from USAID, I'm sure we can work on it. I'm being serious. More questions? From the young generation? Sure, of course.
Obviously, countries have high incentive, as I've seen, to score high on the list. Now, some of the people in the audience here know quite well Stefan Voigt, a German constitutional economist who recently showed us some of the results of his research. And he tried to do a similar correlation between de facto and de jure, different types of freedom, like freedom of the judicial system, etc., and correlated with economic growth. And he noticed strong correlation between the factual freedoms and growth, and very loose and even negative correlation between the US standards and the economic growth. One of the ways I think he tried to explain it was, if the country wants to score high on some index, and it has very little commitment to the documents that it adopts, it can very easily actually adopt quite liberal systems, nice constitution, nice legal system, and then just simply ignore it. On the opposite side, the countries that actually do need to adhere to their constitution and to their legal system, they are more reluctant to change things, to liberalize things. Do you think that this can, that your index can create such a moral hazard as a collateral output? Yeah.
Let me give you just one practical example of how we measure things and what we count, what we don't count. Some years ago, a one-stop shop was created in African country of Côte d'Ivoire. So they wrote a very nice law with international consultants, and the law was passed duly by the parliament, signed by the president. As it turned out in practice, the one-stop shop was more of a mailbox where an entrepreneur would come, put his application in, and then from this mailbox, a couple of clerks would shuttle the documents, around the city. And unfortunately, the process became much longer. So even though on paper there was a great reform and there was a one-stop shop implemented, it was not a functioning one-stop shop. So here we didn't count the reform, and we recorded time that was twice as long as in the previous year. So this is basically how we measure. So it's not really just the book of law, it's the implementation, it's the practice. And that's why the way we measure, we send out questionnaires to practitioners on the ground. So I do not do this research myself. I look at the surveys that I receive from Tbilisi, and then I look at the description of what is happening, at the numbers, and trying to reconcile all the numbers. So from that point of view, I understand the concern, and this is something we hear quite a bit. but I really do not see how you can tweak the numbers, so to speak, without really, changing the way the business is operating. The same thing with electronic filing. One can implement a legislation by saying that, as of tomorrow, everybody has to file online and everybody should have an electronic signature. But unless you have the clearing infrastructure, unless the internet penetration is high enough in the country, it's very difficult to do that. So there is more than just signing a law to, to the doing business indicators.
I remember, I know that your office does have this institutional knowledge. I remember Stefan Jankov 2 years ago actually giving a beautiful presentation about, I think, measuring obtaining driver's licenses in India,
Yeah.
where I think he had an in-depth analysis of these specific differences between reality and what's on paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is something we really are trying to capture, and this is the subject of quite heated discussions with many governments, because we often hear that we implemented this, why don't you count this? And we explain that actually your entrepreneurs on the ground tell us that it doesn't work.
You have this new indicator getting electricity.
Yeah.
Do you think that, or maybe you already know that it will affect getting construction permit indicator, because there we also have connection to electricity.
Yeah.
And are you going to take it out from that survey? I mean that.
It's unlikely because in the construction, licensing will only measure interaction with the utility, with the electricity company. While in the new pilot indicator, we look at a much broader range of agencies. So I think construction will probably stay as it is, and at this point we haven't actually decided yet whether infrastructure will be 11th indicator or it will be standalone research. I think that decision, as well as the protecting workers indicator, will be taken probably in the December-January timeframe. But watch the website, we'll definitely publish that information as soon as it becomes available. No more questions? It's getting late, everybody's tired. All right.
So we finish then. Thank you.
Thank you very much.